Good morning. Let me just get your attention here. We're about to start. Welcome, everyone. I'm Bob Davidson. I'm the president and CEO of the Seattle Aquarium, and thank you for joining us this morning in Puget Sound Great Hall. The Seattle Aquarium's mission is inspiring conservation of our marine environment, and that's what we're all here for this morning. As you can see, we're joined by many school children, which we are every day, and they represent the future. So it's a good reminder to all of us to get this right. As we gather here today, I'd like to humbly acknowledge that we're currently on the homelands of the Coast Salish people, and we're fortunate to live in a city that is named after a great chief, Chief Self, who was a member of the Suquamish and the Duwamish tribes. The Coast Salish people have stewarded these lands and waters for generations. Now, we must all work together for the future of our one world ocean and the surrounding communities. Our future, the future of the southern resident orcas, and the future of the Salish Sea are all inextricably linked. I want to thank Governor Inslee for his leadership on the environment to protect the Salish Sea and establishing the Southern Resident Killer Whale Task Force to save this critically important and iconic species and secure a healthy and sustained population for the future. Special thanks to the nearly 50 members of the task force, a number of whom are here today. Thank you very much for your important work. There are many opinions on what the best steps forward might be, and we're incredibly pleased that this conversation is taking place and being discussed here this morning. As a conservation-rooted organization, the Seattle Aquarium hopes that the recommendations presented today will lead to bold action on behalf of our southern resident orcas. So I'd now like to introduce the co-chairs of the Governor's Orca Task Force. Co-chair Stephanie Soline is the current vice chair of the Leadership Council of the Puget Sound Partnership, the state agency charged with coordinating efforts for recovery of Puget Sound. Stephanie is a longtime civic activist who's worked in politics, in government, in the nonprofit arena for more than 25 years, and in both Washington, D.C. and here in Washington State. And co-chair Les Perce, who is president emeritus of Evergreen State College, from which he retired in 2015 after 17 years in that position. He previously served on the board of directors of the Mount St. Helens Institute and the Eco Trust. So Les, Stephanie, it's all yours.
Thank you, Bob Davidson, and the Seattle Aquarium for so graciously hosting our event this morning. We appreciate your leadership and partnership in marine conservation and education. As co-chairs of the task force, Les Perce and I are honored and humbled to be here today to present the Southern Resident Orca Task Force Year 1 report and recommendations that we sent to Governor Inslee today. This is an ambitious package of science-based recommendations that we believe, if enacted, will make significant progress in recovering our beloved southern resident orcas. This is a day for celebration. Okay. Oh, okay. Sorry. There's a lot of mics up here. It's hard to read. This is a day for celebration. We feel a deep sense of gratitude for the hard work of so many people. First, we want to thank Governor Inslee for his foresight and leadership in establishing the task force. Second, we want to thank task force members who contributed their time, energy, and insights and earnestly worked through their differences to come to agreement on this package. We particularly appreciate the participation of tribal leaders, who as representatives of their sovereign nations joined in our discussions and contributed their spirit and wisdom. Third, we wish to express our deepest gratitude to the members of our 3 working groups on prey, contaminants, and vessel impacts, who contributed their knowledge, expertise, and countless hours helping the task force develop these recommendations. We could not have done this without all of them. Can I ask the task force members that are here today to please raise your hands? Thank you very, very much. And some of the working group members that are here today, would you please raise your hands? Thank you very much. We want to, in particular, thank our working group leads who are here today. Penny Becker with the Department of Fish and Wildlife, Todd Haas with the Puget Sound Partnership, and Derek Day with the Department of Ecology. Steve Martin, who could not be here, was also very important on our Salmon and Prey working group. He's with the Governor's Salmon Recovery Office. The task force was also made aware of the impacts that climate change and rising ocean acidification has on salmon and the orca's environment. Beyond these specific recommendations, we know the issues of climate change and a growing population need to be addressed. We also want to thank the press for being a partner in this journey. Thank you for telling the Southern residents' story. We deeply appreciate your knowledgeable, poignant, and compassionate coverage. You have helped bring the orca's powerful story to people all over the world, especially their struggle to survive. Their stories have educated and inspired people to action. Finally, we wish to express our heartfelt appreciation for the many members of the public who care so deeply about the Southern residents and who fervently ask that we get this right and commit to actions necessary to protect the orcas. We received over 18,000 written comments and were personally moved by the presence and words of individuals who attended and spoke at our meeting. Their passion and concern inspired all of us to redouble our efforts and find consensus on actions that can truly make a difference for our Southern residents. We sincerely hope the public will join us in making these recommendations a reality. When this task force was formed, I recall the skepticism of the media, the public, and even some of us, that a task force this large and diverse could accomplish anything at all. But the orca urged us on. The orca brought us together, and the orca made it possible for us to compromise and reach consensus, step out of our silos, and put the health of the Southern residents first to achieve what many said was impossible. At a time when there is so much division in our country, our task force came together, listened, and learned from each other, as well as the many experts that helped guide our deliberations. I am proud to say this task force prioritized doing what was best for the orcas. For the past 7 months, we have all been on an extraordinary journey. It began at our first meeting in May when the governor asked us to be bold and act urgently. We have held 7-day-long task force meetings across this state. We have all learned so much about what we need to do to ensure these resident orcas don't face extinction. The Southern residents have been a unifying force, bringing people together all over the world. We believe the recommendations we are presenting today will serve to catalyze and guide actions of policymakers across our state and in Canada to help provide more salmon and quieter, pollution-free waters for our beloved southern residents. I want to thank you all for the opportunity to serve on this task force. And now I'd like to turn the mic over to my good friend and fellow co-chair, Les Purse.
Thank you, Stephanie. Can you hear me? I too want to thank the governor for the foresight of establishing this task force. I really want to share my appreciation with all the task force members that have been on this journey with us, as Stephanie has stated. I can only say that in the past 7 months, I have learned more about our ecosystems and the threat that we face as a people here in the Puget Sound. And in this journey, I am struck by 2 11-year-old girls who joined us in Wenatchee, Washington, who waited the whole day during our deliberations to be ready to have the opportunity to speak in the public setting. And their message was courageous and intelligent and heartfelt. They talked about their dream of leaving a legacy for their kids, that their hopes and dreams of seeing the oceans once again abundant with salmon, and to have the opportunity for their children to be able to continue to see these magnificent orcas. At that meeting, we asked them to be witnesses to our work. And I believe that their message and that effort began to solidify the relationship among a diverse group of people that came to the table in that effort itself. Now, we're at a time where we present comprehensive regulations and a hope as well that with these recommendations that the legislature, the governor, and the public can begin to have a real conversation around solutions. You will see in this document a comprehensive description in regard to what the issues are around food for these orcas, the issue of prey, the issues around the dangers that affect our salmon. You will see comprehensive descriptions of issues around the toxins and the contaminants and the reality that we face with the growth of population and the effects of automobiles and our day-to-day life and its negative effect on the Salish Seas and Puget Sound. And you will see in these documents recommendations and descriptions around the challenges of noise and the effect of noise on the orcas. We have tried in each of those areas to make key recommendations that we think and believe will make a difference and will begin to make a difference in all 3 of those areas. And we invite you, the press and the public, to have the opportunity to read this document and to learn as we have about the urgency that we have now towards our ecosystem and our future life here on this earth, really. So with that, we want to give you the opportunity to ask questions about this document. We have our experts with us that help formulate these recommendations with us and to give us the opportunity to respond to those efforts. There have been so many interest groups that have been willing to make sacrifice, to state their point of views, and to support this document. And I really want to particularly note the watching community that have had conversations with us in a key recommendation that speaks to the need to quiet the waters for these orca. It is a recommendation that is directed solely at the orca when they're in that area. It is a recommendation that not only identifies the whale watching community, but all ships, commercial fishermen, recreational fishermen. It is just a simple message that says, when they're in the area, let's find a way to silence the waters so they can find food. We think that with these organizations working with the state agencies, that we're able to come up with a solution that for the next 3 to 5 years that can make a huge difference in their lives. With that said, we would begin to invite questions from the press. Yes.
Recommendation 28. Suspend viewing southern resident orcas. Looks like, can I get some elaboration on that? One way to read it is you're not allowed to watch orcas, get near orcas for 3 to 5 years.
Yes, the question was about recommendation 28 and just what it means. So recommendation 28 is focused on quieting the waters for the endangered southern resident orca. And it's recommending a suspension of 3 to 5 years of all boats viewing and around the southern residents. So it is everything from recreational boats, kayaks, whale watching boats, fishing boats. We have looked at, over the course of the last 6 months, the impacts that vessel noise and disturbance has on the orca's ability to find fish. And with so few fish right now in the waters, especially in Puget Sound, if we can limit boat interference with these orca, they can find the few fish that are there. It is a temporary suspension. We very much support whale watching. There are lots of other whales in which the industry currently now watches, such as the Biggs whales, also called the transients, that survive on marine mammals. They're thriving, they're growing in numbers, and we're also seeing more humpbacks and minke whales in our waters as well. The whale watching industry has been a great partner in leading the way on conservation of the southern residents. They already have in effect voluntary restrictions of viewing the southern residents, and they have also been really important partners along with the scientific research. So it's, and it also right now, because there are so few times a year that the southern residents have been coming back into Puget Sound, that it is a small percentage of the whales that they view, anywhere from 10 to 20%. So we're working closely with them and all the other stakeholders to develop guidelines that will now, the recommendations go to the governor and to the legislature, and there's going to be a number of opportunities to make sure these stakeholders have a voice and that we get this right.
Two follow-up questions on that. One, has the whale watching industry signed into this? I guess because that can be a major effect on San Juan Islands. And two, what do you mean by suspending viewing? Is that
just what it means.
The question is, has the whale watching industry bought into this recommendation? The whale watching industry has expressed concerns about the fact that they wanted to be clear, first of all, that this is a moratorium that affects all vessels in that area. And we are attempting to make that clear. Also, it's important to understand that in order to effectively implement something that can protect these orca, that they will play a key role because they tend to be out on the water more, seeing the variety of whales. In essence, they will be sentinels. They can be in working with Fish and Wildlife to notify the presence in the rare times that they're in the area to make sure that all boats stay away during the time that they're there. There are logistic challenges that can only be overcome by working closely with Fish and Wildlife and the whale watching industry and other vessels. But it's about education when they are there with the goal of vessels staying away in the time when they're in the area. And we think that that can be worked out in such a way that that industry that has been one of the leaders in conservation and consideration for whales can really serve a purpose to make sure that something like this can work. Other questions? So I'm not sure, but I think you asked the question about the issue of breaching the dams, and to reflect on that particular issue and its importance. I would say that out of all of the issues that we have discussed over these last 7 months, the issue around dam breaching, which in essence centers on food availability and the belief that many of our citizens have that in order to really increase the return of salmon, it's important to get into those habitats beyond the lower Snake River dams. In our recommendation, we recognize that it's important for the citizens of this state to have a conversation around the economics, the life and the economics in the eastern part of our state, as well as the science as it relates to the potential benefits that the salmon beyond those dams might face. We know that historically there are tremendous numbers of salmon that came out of the Clearwater and the Snake and the Middle Fork of the Salmon River and the Grand Ronde. The issue is, how can we bring citizens to the table to talk about a solution of what the actual facts are, or what the journey might be in terms of increasing those salmon and being able to recognize and understand the real and true effects of breaching the dams. There are roles that the federal government has and the BPA has, and there's a process that is presently going on of which that is part of the consideration. But we think it's clear from our many conversations with our citizens in the east, our citizens here on the west side, that it's important that we have an expert that can bring the various entities together to begin to have that kind of conversation.
I'd also like to just add that we do take the habitat and the need to bring more Chinook back into the Columbia River system as very important for the southern residents. And one of the recommendations does address the need to increase the spill of water over the Snake and Columbia River dams. And we have a recommendation that would specifically increase the gas cap of 115 that is currently in place now to 125, and allow the dam operators to have flexibility in how that water is spilled. But there is science that shows that if we can increase the water and the spill, more young smolt salmon will get over those dams and out to the ocean quicker and with less injury. And that means they'll come back sooner as well and be food for the southern resident orca. So we have the recommendations of a stakeholder process around breaching, and we also have a recommendation on increasing spill to increase Chinook returns.
Okay. I don't understand why you need both a go slow zone and a moratorium. If you have a moratorium, why do you need the go slow zone?
Yeah. Well, part of it is the most immediate need that we see right now is getting the orca fish. And this temporary suspension will do that quickly. The go slow zone is something that will also need legislation and, you know, might take a little more time, but they're both important. And when the suspension is lifted, going slow is one of the best things we can do around the orcas. So that's one of the reasons it's there.
Do you need legislation for the temporary moratorium?
Yes, and court.
And one follow-up as well. Can you explain the process from here? What happens next? You don't go away after this. Can you spell that out?
Yes.
Yes, we certainly don't go away. We have another year where I think our directive in the executive order is that we sunset in October of next year. And with that comes the kind of work that is necessary on a number of these issues that we've identified. We would assume that in our recommendation concerning the lower Snake River dams, if in fact we can put in place this process of bringing these constituents to the table, that report would come back along with recommendations, and we would hope that we'd be further down the road in regard to that particular recommendation. There likely will also be issues as it relates to some of these items that we have identified that are ongoing issues. I think that in the area of continuing to understand the issues around harvest itself and the relationships that we have with all the partners that are engaged in the issues around harvest, that we understand better how those mechanisms continue to work depending on what the progress are in the return of the salmons themselves. And there are a number of items that we've identified for next year that will be ongoing work that we'll be doing.
Let's just say that now the governor and the people of the state can begin to have a real conversation around solutions. We've just had 7 months of conversation around solutions. When can Orca see some action out of this?
I think when I say solutions, I'm talking about making the commitments in regard to legislation, making the commitments in regard to the resources to be able to implement the recommendations that have been identified here. We know, for example, that in the area of harvest, you can't talk about hatcheries without talking about habitat. You can't talk about hatcheries without understanding the balance between the wild salmon and the hatchery salmon. While we know it's important to be able to get the food to them, the work that is required to expand the hatcheries, as well as to make good, sound, basic science decisions around habitat that protect the wild salmon are key. That will happen not only in regard to funding to support those initiatives that have been identified, but also the kind of policies that need to be put in place in order to be able to do that. That's where the answers are that I was referring to.
And a follow-up, how many whales do we need to have to consider this successful? How many people are not endangered anymore?
Well, we have a vision for these recommendations of an increase of about 2.3% annually. And the hope is to have 10 more whales in about 10 years. And one of the things that I think many of you are aware, there are 3 of the southern residents that are pregnant now. And so all the more reason we need to make sure we move as quickly as we can to get them the food they need. And so they've had difficulties over the last decade in carrying these calves to term. And so all the recommendations, especially around vessel noise, increasing salmon through habitat and hatchery work, as well as the spill on the Columbia Snake River, they all will lead to more fish. And we believe that can happen within both immediately and in the next 3 to 5 years.
Follow-up to that, are those projections based on any kind of scientific methodology?
Yes, they are. And, I'm going to turn to some of our experts to give you more specifics on that.
So your question again is which?
2.3% growth annually, 10 whales in 10 years.
Yeah.
When we look at this slew of recommendations, are those projections based specifically on those actions or how?
So the goal and the vision that's set in the recommendations that the task force has adopted are specifically also connected to the federal recovery plan objectives. So these aren't something new that the task force has put together. It's based upon what the federal government put into place since the recovery plan was put together in 2008. So that's the goal that they have adopted. The number of whales in 10 years is simply that. It's a goal. It's something that we know is possible if we're able to, as Stephanie said, decrease the amount of disturbance from vessels as well as to have more prey available to them so that they can be successful. You can see as an example, if there are females in each pod that are already pregnant, if they're successful just in 1 year, we would be able to get a long way towards that goal.
So they are goals, not in fact a projection and saying if we do these 36 actions, then we expect to have 10 more whales.
The goal is just that. The recommendations themselves all contribute to that goal. So you can't take each recommendation and say, well, this recommendation will give us 1 whale and this one will give us 1.5 whales. But together, the idea is that they do make up enough bold action in order to get to that larger goal.
State your name again.
Penny Becker, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife.
The go slow zones that are listed in these recommendations, listed the ships, would those zones also impact ferries and ferry traffic? They have to go down.
Say your name. Say your name.
Hello, Todd Hass with the Puget Sound Partnership. The Go Slow recommendation is principally about the recreational and whale watching vessels that would look at the southern resident killer whales and doesn't pertain to the shipping traffic that would be going through the area. Separate measures could be applied to shipping, but the Go Slow is really about the proximity to southern residents and slowing down in their presence.
So the ferries would not have to slow.
The ferries right now already have a best practice that it slows them down when they are near the southern residents or when they're near orcas, as I understand it.
Can you also speak to the ECHO program recommendation?
Sure, and again, we have another recommendation that follows the ECHO program from the Port of Vancouver, in which they have conducted trials in the last 2 years to slow down ships in Harrow Strait and Boundary Pass. In this past year, slowing vessels down mainly to 12 or so knots during the summer season, and they've had 90% compliance there, so that we've been able to reduce noise from those ships accordingly.
They also have navigation guides. That be part of it.
I'm sorry, couldn't hear you.
They also have, Canadians also have navigation guides.
Right. There was a separate trial in the northern Strait of Juan de Fuca this past year in which our outbound vessels, largely from the U.S. and Canada, were able to go further south in the outbound lane in order to give them greater distance from the foraging area that's a hot spot for southern residents in the middle of the strait.
Is the committee asking anything of the public other than supporting the legislative agenda? Is there a direct answer?
The question, and I apologize, people are having a hard time hearing the question. So the question was, is the task force asking anything of the public in terms of what they can do to contribute to recovery? And I think the first thing we are asking is support for this package, because this package is comprehensive. We need the funding and we need the legislation to enact much of it. So we do need the public to join us in Olympia in January. But in terms of individual actions, a number of the nonprofits that have been partnering with us, whether it's Washington Environmental Council, the Orca Network, the Center for Whale Research, They have put out a number of actions people can do. Maybe in year 2 we can also include that, but it's things we do every day, from driving our car and making sure it's maintained so it doesn't drip oil, to the kind of household products we use. So thank you for the question. I think it's something, we were focused on some of these bigger comprehensive issues, but individuals can do things, and I would encourage the press to point the public to a number of links, and there are people here that are working on those issues.
And I would just add as well that you asked about the second year, and one thing I think that is clear for the task force and the 2 co-chairs is that the process of educating the public is going to be a critical piece of this effort, particularly as it relates to our day-to-day lives. For example, personally, I've always been a fisherman, and it struck me after being involved in this process that maybe it made sense for me to sell half of my boat to my brother-in-law and to maybe buy an engine that is more efficient and quiet, and to reduce the noise in the water itself. I think that as we begin to think about our lifestyle, that there are ways that we can accommodate what we love in regard to the environment, but to be sensitive to the kinds of issues that can cause toxins in our day-to-day life, and to have conversations in cities and counties about the impact of the toxins that continually pollute the Salish Sea and can make a difference in that way.
Before you answer that question, going back to recommendation 28, I just want to make sure that it's clear that this recommendation is only focused on suspension for the endangered southern resident orca, not the Biggs orca or what we call the transient orcas or any other whales out there. They're doing well. And that this is important because the whale watching industry is an important part of communities around the Puget Sound, and they're jobs for people. So we want people to understand that whale watching is alive and well in the Puget Sound, but we are asking for a temporary suspension to help the endangered southern residents, which is what this task force has been focused on for the last 6 months.
I want to ask, 35 is a lot of recommendations, very complicated. What are some of the ones that you think will move forward the most quickly? Where do you expect to see the quickest action? And what are the ones that are going to take longer?
The question was that 35 or 36 recommendations are a lot. What do you think are the priority ones that may move forward quickly? We like to think about the 3 critical areas that we've identified, and when you look at those recommendations, you'll see that we've teed up recommendations around the habitat, around actions that can provide prey. And I think it will be without a doubt, a message and communication to the legislature and to the public about how each of those areas affect the orca, and that some action needs to occur in all 3 of those areas to give a holistic impact on the challenges that they face. There's been work that has been developed as it relates to hatcheries. We think that there's a good opportunity to grow in that area. We think that beginning the conversations around spill is very important in the Columbia River. We think the issues around contaminants is a huge issue that, with steps that we've identified around regulations that can reduce the impact of certain toxins, that those will be immediate considerations that we hope that the legislature and the public will embrace and begin to take action on.
I think that all those recommendations that Les pointed out are all about increasing Chinook salmon. We know the most immediate thing we need to do is feed these whales, especially now that there are 3 that are pregnant. So we are focusing on actions that will bring more fish. As Les said, we're looking at increasing hatchery production along with habitat protection and acquisition. We're also looking to quiet the waters around these orca so they can find the few fish that are there until the hatchery production is increased. And also spill on the Columbia is something that can have fairly quick turnaround in bringing back Chinook to the Columbia River system. So it's very much focused a lot around the priorities of feeding them in terms of the salmon themselves. They also need targeted focus on pollution hotspots, so we're going to be looking at the issue of stormwater infrastructure to stop toxins from getting into rivers and streams and Puget Sound that we know can kill salmon.
With hatcheries and the increase in salmon for being sort of the immediate thing, has anyone crunched any numbers yet on one, how many more new Chinook do you need? And two, has anyone crunched any numbers on how much money you need to do this increase? Because you're going to have to ask the legislature for X amount of dollars.
I'm going to ask Penny Becker to come up and speak to some of the numbers on Chinook, please.
The question had to do with the hatcheries. Do we know how many more fish we need to feed the orca? And a question about how much it's going to cost. The issue of how much it is going to cost is not something we can answer today. We're in the process, of course, with the governor's office in identifying relative costs as it relates to these recommendations.
Penny Becker, WDFW. So the goals that the task force has for increasing prey for southern residents, again, is from a holistic perspective. So some of those increases we hope will occur due to increases in habitat protection and restoration. Some of those will be from hatchery production. Some of those will be from things like Stephanie said about increased spills, so we have more survival of the fish through the dams. And so the goal is not that any one recommendation will get us there, it's the combination of all of them together. The Department of Fish and Wildlife is currently working through guidance that they have already received from the legislature to look at where do we have capacity to increase production currently, and then looking at what sort of investments need to be made in the longer run so that we could increase capacity to do more production where it's feasible and needed for southern residents.
Okay, I'm trying to pin you down. I'm making these numbers off the top of my head, but I'm trying to pin you down and say, yeah, we produce 6 million Chinook salmon a year out of Washington, and we need to get it up to 8 million. Mm-hmm. Do we have any numbers that would plug into that sentence?
No, nothing that I would give you to plug into that sentence, no.
Okay, we have a couple of more questions.
Linda?
Yeah.
Thank you. I have a follow-up on dam removal. I just very quickly read through the recommendations, but it seemed like on dam removal, what I saw was asking WDFW to assess what it would take, feasibility for dam removal in various places. But I didn't see a straight-up recommendation that any dam in Washington should be taken out. Sag, shower retention passage. I saw study. I didn't see anything that said take it down. Can you clarify?
There is in the request for habitat restoration and recovery at least one, if not two, dams. And Laura, I'm going to just ask you to please come up and speak to that, because we do have some Puget Sound dams that are ready to come down.
Laura's with the Puget Sound Partnership, everyone.
Yes, thank you. Yes, in Habitat Recommendation Number 1 calls for significantly increasing funding for restoring and protecting habitat across the state of Washington. One of the details in there is that includes the list of projects that each of the 7 salmon recovery regions in Washington state submit to the legislature every year. My agency works in Puget Sound, and on our list this year we have 2 projects that are dam removals. One is the middle fork of the Nooksack Dam, and one is on the Pilchuck River. So if that were fully funded, those 2 dams would come out ideally in the next 2 years.
What was the second one?
It's the Pilchuck Dam on the, yep.
The total cost is what?
I don't remember the total cost for those particular projects, but our total funding request for that list of projects is $79.6 million. No, that's not all. There's if Habitat Recommendation 1 were fully funded, the number would be much larger. I think OFM is still crunching those numbers.
That's not just for dam removal.
But it's not just dam removal, right? It's all kinds of habitat protection and restoration projects. So culvert removal, estuary restoration.
79 is for dam removal?
The 79.6 would cover the 2 dam removal projects, but it also includes, I think we have 11 very large projects and then 66 smaller projects. So it would get us to whatever that is, 77 projects.
So 79, I'm sorry, just to clarify.
Yep.
Is for the 2 dam removals you spoke of?
No. The $79.6 million is for the Puget Sound Acquisition and Restoration Program, which is a program that the Washington State Legislature funds every biennium. Thank you very much to the legislature for that. And the way that that program works is that our region comes together and says, what are the most important habitat restoration and acquisition projects we can do in Puget Sound over the next 2 years? So our list includes 77 projects. 2 of those are dam removal projects. And I think I have the numbers right on the total number of projects.
And that's one of the task force registers?
Yes, Habitat Recommendation 1.
And can we get them those?
Yes, absolutely. We can get you those numbers. Yeah.
One more. Yes.
Many people have said we should be cutting back or eliminating Chinook salmon commercial fishing. These do not recommend that. Why does it recommend just reducing slightly as the Pacific salmon breeds? That's sufficient. Why are we? It calls for very, very limited reductions in commercial Chinook salmon harvest. Why not do more? Call for more.
Well, it's important to note that the decisions in regard to the harvest involve a number of entities, and it's based on the treaties that have been established. The projection of returns, and that is the basis that guides, for example, when the Columbia River is closed, based on projections of returns. Now, we can't comment on that system as to if it's perfect, and there may be challenges that are associated with that. But that's how that proportion of the harvest and the allocations work. And they're, of course, shared government to government with the tribes and the federal regulations and the state of Washington and Oregon. And of course, some of the work that we'll continue to do in this next year has to do with a number of areas that will require us to work more closely with Canada around planning for harvest, planning for issues as it relates to the salmon themselves and the effects that have on the southern residents as well. So we can see a number of areas because the Canadian government sat in this task force, but as an observer, and we're hoping that the dialogue in those common areas that involves transboundaries deepens, and we're able to develop common kinds of policies that can be even more effective in those areas.
Thank you.
We want to thank everyone for coming, and we appreciate so much the interest again and the citizens and the news media, and of course, if we can answer any questions after this conference itself, we're so deeply appreciative. It's been quite a journey, and the journey will continue because the momentum that has been developed and the interest in the public, we have confidence in as a message about the importance of how we will live in the Northwest in the future. And we should all be involved in that and become educated in all parts of this state. Thank you all so very, very much.